Really excited to get a chance to see everybody. I know that there's so much that's been going on in the world. Currently, I'm coming to you guys from Northern California, where you guys might know there have been some really crazy fires that have happened in Northern California. It's pretty, gosh, just really tragic and kind of insane, everything that's been going on. I don't think I ever had heard before that there was a such thing as a tornado fire. So if you guys are if you guys are wondering about what's a tornado fire, feel free to check that out online. It's certainly something I never thought I'd be experiencing before. So interesting times. Today we are talking about influencer marketing, and I'm really excited to get a chance to talk to you guys about this. Let me see if I can move this live stream down here so you guys have a bit of a better angle instead of so much of this back wall. But basically, guys, when it comes to influencer marketing, I'm sure you guys have been hearing so much about what is happening in the space, especially as we've been seeing a lot of brands cut down on their budgets. So what does that mean, and how do we need to be considering these particular components? So when we're looking at influencer marketing, hey guys, thanks for joining. When we're thinking about influencer marketing and we're thinking about all the different ways of being able to do this strategically, kind of going forward into 2021, there are a lot of different things that we have to be considering. So number one, as a brand, I know a lot of people have been cutting back on their budgets. Well, what happens when you start to cut back on your budgets is all of a sudden these influencers start to get a little bit cheaper. I don't know if you guys have been seeing a lot of outreach from different social media organizations, but people are really trying to find ways of getting better in front of influencers and in front of brands. And so when we're looking into 2021, we're going to find not only, I believe, cheaper rates when it comes to work with influencers, but also better opportunities and better contracts. So those of you guys who have been struggling in the past with finding ways of getting in front of these influencers, what I would suggest is the following. Number one, it's obviously very important to kind of maintain a very streamlined positioning on who is the right fit. I currently sit on the board of directors of one of the largest women's nonprofits in Los Angeles called the Downtown Women's Center. And we were talking about the other day how to best kind of build out a influencer marketing campaign. And these guys are a nonprofit, so a lot of people are interested in working with them. But what did we do? We sat down and said, okay, who are the actual influencers who actually fit the brand values and kind of fit the aesthetics, like content-wise, of what it is we're going after, right? Where is it going to be an actual real fit? And then where does it start to feel like something that maybe we are pushing too hard on? And so I would say before you guys start to think about influencer marketing, the most important thing is going to be to sit down and say, what actually makes a partner a good fit? Right? What are the things that are actually going to be the most important to be able to kind of expand and grow on? And if you can start to figure out what makes a good fit, then all of a sudden you figure out what is a no and what is a yes. And then you can start to look through the lens of partnerships and collaborations through the perspective of what a no is and through the perspective of what a yes is. So I think it's extremely valuable to do that kind of exercise, especially as you're looking into Q4, if you're planning on any like holiday launch giveaways. And also this kind of strategy of what's a yes and what's a no, I think is also super important as you look at any sort of brand partnerships. So historically, guys, when it comes to Q4, we're oftentimes looking at giveaways, new product exclusives, influencer collaborations. We're looking at things that are going to be a lot more 360 in terms of getting in front of your customer. Chances are you're probably not going to be doing that pop-up shop that you were planning on doing for Q4. Chances are, if you are going to be thinking about, doing these kinds of collaborations, right, you're going to have to really be planning them out very thoughtfully. And right now, as we're embarking on September, we should be actually planning out our Q4 marketing and strategic planning timelines. So when it comes to influencer marketing, a lot of the same rules go as they were before, right? Make sure that you have the right fit, make sure you have the right contracts in place. So that's also super important. And then also, guys, do not stop thinking about the importance of actually looking at things like, public relations as a public relations as kind of a strong revenue stream in terms of getting that natural exposure. So oftentimes with influencer marketing, we kind of think about things that are like, okay, I'm going to pay for this post. And hopefully if you're doing it the right way, it ends up being more organic and it doesn't feel quite as forced. However, when we start to think about influencer marketing through the lens of maybe public relations and things being natural and things being gifted, you actually have a much higher opportunity there to get your product actually on that celebrity or on that influencer because it's a natural fit. Now, a lot of companies I know are just interested in transacting. They just want to give product or give money and assume that they're going to get some transaction here. Certainly giving away product is one way you can approach it, but giving away a free product isn't necessarily going to guarantee anything, right? And paying for things anymore isn't necessarily going to mean it's a good fit. So I would be very careful and wary of how you're orchestrating your influencer launches. However, if you've decided that you have the financial budget and you want to go forward with influencer marketing, my suggestion would be to start to take a step back and say, okay, how am I going to approach this and tier out the scale of the influencers, right? Do you start with the big influencers and then start to work and kind of whittle down to smaller influencers? Or do you start small and kind of work your way back up? In my kind of perspective here, right? What I would say is starting off with your smaller influencers so you can start to gain some more regional brand presence, preferably starting in the regions where you already have customers or you already have mapped out is really the best way to start. So you start regionally, start to gain some regional followers. And then all of a sudden, by the time you're kind of working with these bigger guys, you're almost approaching these national influencers as more like national advertising campaigns, right? So if you look at influencer marketing in terms of like campaigns and how we look at marketing in general, you want to start with local, right? You want to start small. Usually smaller is always cheaper, usually higher converting, better opportunities to kind of capture a customer. It's more intimate. And then as you kind of scale up, as that customer who's looking at that larger influencer starts to then look at your brand and the other people who've tagged you and your other influencer collaborations, they start to basically see that as being, they see it as kind of being a bit more supported, right? So that's the way that I would look at it. It's starting small and then kind of growing up into those kind of larger, more national campaigns. The issue when you just kind of come out the gate with a national influencer is, number one, it's very expensive. And number two, it needs to be consistent and you need to be able to apply that to multiple markets. So for example, if you're a new fashion brand, yeah, obviously you're probably going to hit up some fashion stylists, but you want to make sure you're also penetrating influencers across different segmentations and different markets. And why is that important? Well, the concept of influence, I think, is one that needs to be, unpacked, right? As we're seeing right now with things like, the DNC conventions, right? Everyone who spoke is really an influencer, right? When you start to think about brands and kind of who's wearing what product and how are people showing up? There are so many different ways of looking at influence that I would actually urge you to kind of take a step back and instead of saying, okay, digital advertising, social media influencers, I would take a step back and say, well, who are the people that actually hold influence in my target market and in my demographics? And by identifying who has influence, you might actually find yourself gifting or dressing someone that wouldn't necessarily have 50,000 followers, but their influence ends up being a lot more impactful to your customers, right? Maybe they post about you in their newsletter. Maybe they're in a photograph and they highlight the fact that you're wearing it. Or, for example, maybe they have a podcast and maybe they're highlighting what brands that they love in their podcast, right? So look at it not just from the perspective of a pure play Instagram social media thing. I would look at it more from the perspective of what are the opportunities for me to get my business or my brand in front of a larger target audience, and leverage influence and product and gifting to do so. Now, what's also interesting is when you go through the lens of just influence rather than just social media influencers, you may also not have to pay for it, right? So there is something kind of less transactional when you're finding true influencers across different target markets. So as far as like, how to start to look at mapping out these campaigns, I'll go over kind of what 2021 is going to be looking like. If you guys have any questions or anything else you want to kind of bubble up either on Facebook or YouTube or on Instagram, let me know. Okay, so we do have a question. In my experience, do I find an ad in Oprah Magazine is as good as an influencer type channel? Though it's expensive, wouldn't the large community be worth it? Okay, so advertising on major publications is a really good question. I've launched multiple brands who've gotten into Oprah Magazine without paying for it. So if you're thinking about paying for something, I would actually highly suggest that you ask yourself, is there an alternative route to getting into this publication that maybe feels a bit more organic? Maybe it's an editor's pick for the holiday. So maybe you actually hire instead of spending the advertising dollars, maybe you're actually looking at it from the perspective of where can my publicist help me find distribution in terms of getting it out there, because that can go a very, very long way. However, if you're thinking about advertising, I would say, what kind of advertising is it? So for example, Harper's Bazaar is known for calling small advertising space to small brands. And it's like an advertorial, and they kind of list it as like, top products to purchase, but it has on the top that it's an advertisement. It's an advertorial. And they tried to curate it to make it look less advertisingly, but it's still an advertising, right? It's really funny, organic. I know, it's so funny. We're like, what is organic anymore? But yeah, so when you're thinking about advertising, in those platforms, I would say, is there a way where you can kind of get in there in a way that seems more organic rather than paying for that advertising? If you can do that, I would do that first before you actually take the leap into doing it through just a particular, advertising platform. We are overrun with advertisements. That's a really good point. Urban Entity Clothing. I think that's a really good point. When it comes to how we're looking at ad placements, though, for example, I would say podcasts are still a really good spot right now to look at advertising. On Spotify, that's a good place to be looking for advertising because it's not just getting in front of people they can see the product, given that more and more people are listening to podcasts while they're working, they are on Spotify, they're listening to music. Finding these different touch points to be able to get in front of your customer in a way that's not so obvious, I actually think is a really great way to look at it. When you're doing it from that perspective and it's less obvious, you actually might find yourself being like, oh, interesting, I never heard of that brand. Let me think about that brand. And despite what you might think, people actually do go into the show notes and click on the thing in order to get that discount to purchase from that brand. And if that company that podcaster has a large enough, brand visibility or brand presence, I actually think that is a really amazing way to kind of more subversively get the messaging and get your word out there. So different channels of advertising, I think, are important. We are overrun with it. But I do think it's valuable. The other thing I would also consider, guys, when it comes to advertising is YouTube and YouTube advertising. Now, again, this is a conversation on influence. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about, different advertising channels unless you guys have questions around that. But when I think about things that are like, what's great about YouTube is especially now that more and more of our cable news programming is now being consumed through YouTube channels. Right? That means that, our consumption of video and also everyone being at home so much more, there are a lot more eyeballs that are being seen on YouTube. So again, starting to pick your battles here. I mean, obviously with YouTube, that requires not just great sound system and being able to produce good quality audio, which you would in a podcast, whether that's like you're sponsoring the ad and the host is speaking it or whatever the case is. But when it comes to things that are like, looking at like these YouTube videos, you are going to have to be producing YouTube videos. And that is going to be a little bit of a chunk of change on your budget. But given that most Q4 plans are kind of out the window, I just don't know where else you're allocating your resources. So I would definitely take a look at kind of YouTube as a really cool activation for getting your brand out there during Q4. And guys, to be honest, depending on what your budget is on this, you can actually strategically be placing your YouTube videos on channels like Vogue or on channels that are currently selling advertising space. So again, through a very similar mode of what's a yes and what's a no, you actually want to have the opportunity to be able to say, okay, this channel is a no, right? This person's channel is a no for these reasons. This person's channel is a yes. And then when you go through to distribute and kind of choose where you want your ads to show up, you can have that sort of visibility. So Shannon, you asked a good question. What's my website? In fact, you can find me on Makers Row. You can find me on Embark Live if you want to book some time to chat more. And I am the CEO of Scaling Retail. So that's what I do. And you can find me on these platforms, which is exciting. So today, we're doing a kind of, small group sesh on, what it looks like to plan out influencer marketing strategies. And that's going to be coming up shortly. So if you guys are interested in kind of unpacking a little bit more what that might mean for your business, right? How are you starting to look at your resource allocation? How are you starting to look at the checklist that you're going to be creating? I think that's going to be a really smart opportunity to flex and kind of get some of those questions answered. Here, if I had to choose between allocating a small marketing budget towards sponsored content or through influencer marketing, or sponsoring my own ad on my social media channels, what would I recommend? Okay. So Salwa, what I would say is when it comes to looking at your ad spend, I would start by saying, where is my customer? Know where your customer is and then go after that channel very specifically. So what does that mean? That means if what you're telling me is, sponsored content, so I would say, so through influencer marketing, if I was looking at an influencer driven campaign or sponsoring my own advertisement, I would ask myself, what is the budget? So to do online advertising for less than $2,000 a month, in my mind, just doesn't really yield the ROAS and the ROI that I'm more comfortable with, right? Like I like to have a bit of a bigger budget for testing and iterating, trying lots of things and getting feedback. And when it comes to, the other component of that, which is like influencer marketing, the question would be, what's the cost of the influencer marketing and what's the potential reach? So what's really cool is on Facebook Business Ads Manager, you guys can all go in there and set up a mock ad and say, okay, if I put this budget, here's my anticipated reach and here's the anticipated click-throughs, right? You can get a really easy mock-up of what it potentially is going to look like. If you go on an influencer's website, on their social media page, you can say, okay, here is the number of followers they have, here's their engagement, and here are the kinds of brands they've also been promoting, right? Are they like brands? Now, oftentimes, if you're working with an influencer that has worked with other kinds of brands, it's not going to be hard to reach out to the marketing campaign, the marketing department of that other brand and say, hey, how did that go for you? Right? Like, did you find a good return on investment on doing your campaign? Maybe yes, maybe no, right? Good to know. So I would say start to kind of dig a little bit deeper in terms of how you're looking at what that conversion will look like, depending on your budget, depending on the audience, right? I can't tell you where to spend your money unless you have more information. And that I think is an important thing to consider, like when we start to look at what is the right strategy for your business. I spoke to someone the other day who was like, Shama, I've got, $20,000 to spend for the year. And I always say, and I'm like, okay, well, $20,000, you need to make that as meaningful as possible, right? $50,000 you have to make as meaningful as possible. But if you had 50 versus 20, I would tell you to do different things because meaning and what you can create and do out of that becomes really different, right? It becomes based on your budget and your goals. Similarly, this is also very true for any of you guys who are bootstrapping your own businesses with your day job, right? We have this really crazy feeling of I'm just going to pay for bills as they come up. But how on earth, guys, do you plan on actually executing any sort of marketing campaign or planning any sort of strategy without having a budget that you're working with? And yes, plans exist in order to be changed, right? Plans exist in order to they exist in order to change. And so what I would say is a really important component of this is to say, like, plan ahead your resources. Figure out what kind of money you have to work with. Once you figure out the money you have to work with, then I would say it's super important to then take the time to then back off from it, right? And say, I have this amount of money. What's the strategy with this amount of money? And then if you somehow start to generate more revenue from your business or some other access point of money, then you can expand on that strategy, but you have to allocate some budget to something. And if you're paying from it from your day job, then you should know, all right, I'm going to be able to save $1,000 a month to pay for my business. But if you're not actually looking at it with some sort of foresight and planning, guys, you're just end up shooting yourself in the foot. So my advice is influencer marketing, advertising in general. Please make sure you take the time and energy to map out your budgets. Let's make sure you have a list of yeses and nos. So this is what makes a no. It's what makes a yes. I'm sure all of you guys get hit up for influencer marketing campaigns. I do, and I don't even have like I'm not like an influencer, and I get hit up to like be an influencer. And I'm like, I don't even know, like, did you guys even look at my Instagram? like I'm not a fashion, like I don't do that, right? I'm not like a stylist or something. But it's smart because those are people who are saying, here is someone who has a potential to have influence over people who's not a traditional influencer. I just don't do things like that. It would be safe to assume that there'd be lots of other people who would be open to doing those kinds of influencer arrangements, even though they may not necessarily be your traditional, fashion stylist or fashion blogger. I'm not neither of those things. So I would say, guys, again, yeses, nos, look for opportunities to find influence kind of in areas that you may not necessarily be thinking about. I think that's really important. There's a lot of great opportunity that's available to you if you kind of take the time to look a little bit harder. And then beyond that, right, make sure you have your budgets. All right, guys, any other questions about marketing, influencer campaigns? I hope you guys are all kind of planning ahead for your fall, winter 2020. Who would have thought 2020 could get even more bizarre? But it has. And I'm here in Northern California where it's just extremely smoky and super bizarre, and really hoping that we see, this kind of incredible Q4 that we've all been, really hoping for. What should we expect from influencers? How do we negotiate multi-platform posting or greater cadence? You negotiate through, this is like a whole other class. Shannon, if you want to join the 1 hour group session that we're doing, we can kind of unpack that a lot more. Basically, when you're thinking about like negotiations, that's like a whole separate topic, right? It's like you need to have a really good understanding of what your macro is and kind of what you're goaling for, and then you need to stuff as much as you can into the boundaries of what the macro is, right? So you never want to start by cherry picking small things. You really want to start by looking at the larger goals here and then stuffing it into that. Okay, Stephanie, do you think a popular fashion site that charges $300 to post one item is worth paying for to drive traffic to purchase? So that depends. You need to take a look at their traffic. Take a look at their Alexa rating. How much traffic do they have? What are the other websites that are like them? Get some information from them on their traffic. You guys should stop spending money and don't spend money on things without actually having any sort of benchmarking or some sort of understanding as to what the hell you're spending money on. Right? So I couldn't tell you $300 is a good or a bad number because I have no idea how much traffic they're actually going to be giving to you. Okay, last question. I'm currently sourcing in China. I have my sample handbags ready, but is it smarter to place a large production order? Is China doing business in the US right now? Yes, place your order. The issue right now with orders and deliveries are going to be that everyone's rushing right now to get orders placed. Business is still continuing, guys. Everyone's planning for just these like super, uber, mega Q4 e-com sales. So like get your product, plan a distribution strategy, and make it happen because there's a lot you need to be planning for. Thoughts on a viral pop-up, on virtual pop-ups? Yes, virtual pop-ups are great, but you've got to look at them through a very like cohesive perspective here, which is like a virtual pop-up is, has to be well orchestrated. Otherwise, you're not going to have the opportunity to be able to like really capture and kind of close in on them, right? So you can't just say, I'm doing a pop-up, right? You actually need to be able to orchestrate, like, who am I segmenting with this pop-up? Like the worst thing that anyone could do would be like, I'm doing a pop-up and I'm inviting the whole world. It's like you lose meaning, you lose contrast, you lose exclusivity, you kind of lose the specialness. So whatever you guys do it very discreetly, come at it from a unique perspective, budget, plan it, what's a yes, what's a no. Get more information before you guys spend any more money on shit. Like it's not worth it. $300 could seem like nothing, right? Or it could seem like the world to you. But unless you know what the expected ROI is on that, you don't know how much meaning to make out of that $300. All right, guys. Catch me at the 4 p.m. Eastern Expert Talk. Really fun. We talk about lots of cool stuff. Help to kind of dive in a little bit deeper into your businesses.